The wind always seemed to whistle a little lonelier across the wide plains of Dry Creek. The village was no more than a cluster of timber-front shops, a church with a leaning steeple, and a single rail line that ran like a scar across the land. Beyond that, ranches stretched for miles, stitched together by sagging fences and endless sky. Out there, a man could disappear into the dust, and plenty did. Folks whispered about how the land made men quiet, how it pressed on the bones until even laughter seemed too loud. That was why people noticed when the rancher out west started talking about a bride. He wasn't known for talking much, not even to the men he hired when cattle needed driving. Most in town only called him the Loner Rancher, a name that carried equal parts respect and pity. He lived a good 5 miles beyond the village line, his spread sitting between two rocky hills like a fortress. At the saloon, men leaned on their glasses and said he had more cattle than friends, more horses than conversations. And yet, word slipped through that he had ridden east, sent letters to an agency that matched lonely men on the frontier with women willing to travel, a mail-order bride. Folks in Dry Creek perked up at that. It promised gossip richer than whiskey. The stagecoach driver was the first to stir the pot. He swore up and down that he had been asked to keep watch for a passenger headed to the rancher's claim. The blacksmith's wife nearly dropped her hammer when she overheard. The preacher prayed extra long on Sunday, though he did not say why. In truth, everyone was waiting. Life in Dry Creek rolled slow, but this was something new, a story that could cut through the sameness of cowbells and dust storms. The rancher himself stayed steady through it all. He still came into town for supplies once a week, still bought nails, lamp oil, and sacks of flour like he had for years. His face gave nothing away. If anyone dared ask about the bride, he'd just give a small shrug and tip his hat. Some said he wasn't eager, only patient. Others said he was foolish for thinking any woman would ride all the way west just for him. But he had already built the small cabin beside his main house, laid out quilts, and set a rocking chair on the porch. Out there, beneath the endless stars, he was ready. Summer thinned into autumn. The cottonwoods browned and shed their leaves along the creek bed. One afternoon, a letter arrived, carried by the stage. The postmaster read the name on the envelope twice before sliding it into the rancher's calloused hand. A hush had fallen across the shop, as though the whole town leaned in. He pocketed the letter, nodded, and walked out without a word. What was written inside only he knew, but the postmaster swore he saw his brow crease deeper than usual when he left. Weeks later, the stage rattled into town with more than dust clinging to its wheels. 2 women stepped down, and the air went still. They wore traveling dresses, though the hems were already stained by the long road. Their bonnets shaded their faces, but as they turned, people gasped. The women were joined at the side, bound together in a way that no seamstress had stitched, as if fate had decided they would never walk alone. They moved carefully, 2 souls sharing one stride, one balance, one life. The driver fumbled their bags down while the townsfolk gawked. Whispers ran faster than the creek after rain. Sisters? Conjoined? Lord have mercy. The preacher's wife clutched her shawl tighter, while children peered from behind skirts, wide-eyed and unblinking. No one spoke loud, but every heart pounded with the same question. Were these the brides? The women stood proud despite the stares. Their eyes scanned the crowd, searching, until they landed on the tall figure who had just ridden in from the edge of town. The Loner Rancher drew up his horse, swung down, and for once his face betrayed him. Shock flickered across his features like lightning across the plains. The letter had not told him this. He stepped forward, boots scuffing the dust, hat clutched tight in his hand. The crowd watched, waiting for some sign: rejection, anger, mercy. The silence stretched until the cicadas themselves seemed to hush. The rancher looked from one woman's face to the other, twin yet distinct, bound yet separate, and the weight of the prairie settled heavy on his shoulders. He had asked for a bride, a partner to share his lonely land. What fate had sent him? Was something no man could have prepared for. The conjoined brides met his gaze with steady calm. One spoke, her voice clear as the church bell on a winter morning, while the other nodded in quiet agreement. "We came as promised. Do you still wish for us?" The question hung in the air, sharper than any blade. The townsfolk leaned closer, breath caught in their chests. The rancher's hand trembled ever so slightly on the brim of his hat, the dust swirling at his feet like restless spirits. Out beyond the hills, thunder grumbled, though no storm yet showed. And there, in that small village at the edge of nowhere, every soul waited to see what choice would be made. The rancher opened his mouth to answer, but the words never came. For just then, the wind carried the sound of another stagecoach in the distance, wheels clattering, horses straining, something unexpected rolling closer by the minute. The brides turned toward the road, their joined shadows stretching long in the late light. The townsfolk exchanged uneasy glances. Whatever had begun with a letter and a promise was not finished. It was only just unfolding, and no one in Dry Creek, not even the loner rancher himself, could guess how far this strange story would reach. And so they all stood, breathless and waiting, as the second coach drew nearer. The sound of the second stagecoach grew louder, until it echoed off the false fronts of the town's shops and bounced along the wooden planks of the boardwalk. Horses strained against the traces, their hooves clattering against the hard-packed road as the driver cracked his whip. Dust billowed behind the coach in thick waves, curling around the church steeple and swallowing the last of the sunsets. Glow. Everyone in Dry Creek stood frozen, unsure whether to step back or step forward. It wasn't often one stage rolled through at dusk, let alone two. Something about it felt wrong, as if the land itself had taken a deep, uneasy breath. First stage had already delivered its shocking cargo, the two women bound together in body yet resolute in spirit. The loner rancher still hadn't spoken. He stood rooted in place, hat in his hand, caught between the gaze of the crowd and the expectant eyes of the brides. The second coach rattled closer, its wheels squealing as it hit a rut, and more whispers rippled through the onlookers. If the first stage had carried such a twist, what could the second be bringing? The driver pulled the team to a halt in front of the general store. His face was weary, coated in dust, and his shoulders slumped like a man who'd seen more than he cared to describe. He climbed down, nodded stiffly to the crowd, and opened the door of the coach. The town held its breath. Out stepped a tall man in a black traveling coat, his hat tilted low and a carpetbag in his grip. He wasn't like the ranchers or miners who drifted in from time to time. His boots looked polished despite the dust, and there was a sharpness about him, a deliberate air, as though he belonged to a world far removed from cattle herds and lonely prairies. He scanned the gathering with quick, calculating eyes before resting them on the rancher and the women still standing near the first stage. "Evening," he said, his voice steady, carrying just enough to be heard by all. "I believe I'm expected." "Ah." Murmur rolled through the townsfolk like a wave. Expected? By whom? The preacher's wife tugged at her shawl again. The blacksmith's boy craned his neck, and the postmaster frowned as if searching his memory for a lost letter. The loner rancher stiffened, jaw tightening, but still he said nothing. The man in the black coat adjusted his grip on the bag and added, "I've come to settle an arrangement. This concerns the brides." Gasps broke out, and for the first time since stepping down from the stage, the conjoined women shifted uncomfortably. One looked at the rancher, the other at the stranger. The tension tightened, drawing the silence taut as barbed wire. The rancher finally spoke, his voice gravel deep and even. "Who are you?" The stranger smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "That can wait. What matters is this. I hold papers that say the women are not bound to any single man until certain terms are met. And those terms," he paused, lifting his bag slightly as if the proof were inside, "are not yet fulfilled." The townsfolk erupted in whispers. Contracts, papers, terms, it all sounded more like dealings from the East than the raw honesty of frontier life. No one in Dry Creek could recall the last time a lawyer, or whatever this man might be, had stepped foot in their dusty village. The preacher stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Sir, perhaps you'd best explain yourself proper. These women have traveled a great distance. We ought to hear what claim you make before judgments fall." The stranger gave a slow nod, but his gaze never left the rancher. "I will explain, but not here, not in the open street." He gestured toward the saloon, its lanterns already glowing through the windows. "Inside, over a table, away from the dust and gawking eyes. That is where business is done." The rancher hesitated. His eyes flicked toward the brides, who stood close together, their clasped hands a natural extension of their joined lives. One of them whispered softly to the other, though no one else caught the words. At last the rancher replaced his hat on his head and gave a curt nod. "Fine, but the women stay near me." Together, the group moved into the saloon. The crowd followed as far as the doors, but most held back, content to press their faces against the glass or linger on the porch boards. The bartender, a man with thinning hair and a bent back, nearly dropped a glass when he saw the company filing in. He set out a bottle and glasses without being asked. Sensing that this was not an evening for arguments, the stranger set his carpetbag on the table and unbuckled it slowly. The brides sat close to each other on the bench, while the rancher stood behind them like a watchful shadow. The lantern above the table swung slightly, casting restless light across the stranger's pale hands as he withdrew a stack of folded papers. He spread them carefully, his movements precise as though every crease carried weight. "These are agreements signed back east," he said evenly. "Agreements made with the women's family. It was understood that they would travel west together as they cannot be parted, and that a man willing to take one must take both. But there are conditions that involve property, care, and promises not yet seen through." The rancher leaned forward, his voice low. "And who gives you the right to speak for them?" The stranger's smile sharpened. "The family entrusted me. More than that, the law does. Without my word, these papers hold no life. With it, they decide the future." The women shifted uneasily, their eyes darting between the two men. Finally, one spoke, her voice steady but laced, with quiet urgency. "We came because we were told there was a man who wished for us, who would not turn us away. We did not ask for papers or strangers or rules. We only asked for a place." Her sister touched her hand gently, nodding in silent agreement. The rancher's gaze softened, if only for a moment, but the stranger cut through. "Feelings don't set the terms. Land, money, and care do. And unless those are settled, no vows can be spoken, no bonds recognized. That is the truth, however hard it sits." Outside, the townsfolk waited, hushed but restless, the light from the saloon spilling onto the dirt street. A storm brewed far off in the plains, faint lightning tracing the horizon, and the wind carried with it the smell of rain not yet fallen. Inside, the air thickened. The rancher, the stranger, and the bride sat caught in a web that none of them had expected. A man who lived alone, two women bound by birth and fate, and a messenger carrying papers heavy with unseen weight. The bottle on the table remained untouched. The tension in the room clung like the dust of the trail, settling into every crack of the floorboards. The stranger tapped the papers once, lightly, with the back of his hand. The choice, rancher, is not as simple as you hoped. It never was. You wanted a bride. What you received was a trial. And if you fail it, the consequences may reach farther than this small town can imagine. The brides lowered their eyes, their shoulders close, as if bracing for whatever storm was about to break. And in the distance, another rumble of thunder rolled closer, as though the prairie itself was listening, waiting, and watching. The storm. Outside edged closer, flashing across the plains with a light that made the windows of the saloon flicker. The room itself had gone still after the stranger's words, the only sound the groan of the floorboards as the bride shifted against the bench. The rancher stood rigid behind them, his hands resting on the chair, every muscle locked as if the earth beneath him had suddenly grown unsteady. The stranger leaned back in his seat, calm and certain, as though he had delivered a sermon that none could question. Yet the silence that followed was not one of agreement but of unease. The bartender, who had been trying to busy himself polishing glasses, stopped pretending and leaned in closer. Even his breath sounded loud. From outside came muffled whispers. The townsfolk pressing themselves against the thin walls, trying to snatch bits of truth from what was unfolding inside. All across Dry Creek, gossip had wings, and by morning every homestead for miles would know of the two brides and the papers that bound them. The bride sat joined at the hip, their skirts pooling together across the wooden bench. One of them finally raised her head, eyes steady on the stranger. Our family may have trusted you, but we do not. We left that world behind when we stepped on the train. We came west for freedom, not more rules. Her sister's hand rested firmly on hers, echoing the resolve in silence. The stranger's smile flickered but did not vanish. Freedom is not bought with wishes, he said, tapping the stack of papers again. Freedom is bought with land, with agreements, with signatures. Out here, that man, he tilted his chin toward the rancher, may believe he can take you as he pleases. But without these terms met, nothing you share with him will carry weight, not in law, not in name, not in inheritance. The rancher's voice broke the heavy quiet, deep and steady. I didn't ask for law. I asked for a partner. His eyes fixed on the brides, not the stranger. You came. That's enough for me. The stranger chuckled under his breath, a sound that drew a shiver through the crowd outside the doors. And what happens when others come asking questions? When men from farther east ride in with claims of their own? Will you fight them all? Or will you bend when the law proves stronger than your fists? The brides exchanged a look and unspoken conversation that passed between them with a shared blink and the faintest tilt of a chin. One of them drew in a slow breath. We do. Not fear men like you, she said. We've been stared at, whispered about, judged since birth. If you think papers will bind us tighter than we already are, you do not understand us at all. The stranger's jaw tightened just enough to betray the crack in his confidence. But he quickly masked it with another faint smile. He began folding the papers, each crease loud in the tense air, as though sealing an unspoken threat inside every fold. Very well, he said. If you will not honor the terms tonight, then tomorrow you will. And if not tomorrow, then the day after. This is not a matter you can run from. The plains are wide, yes, but my reach is wider. He slipped the papers back into his carpetbag and closed the clasp with a sharp snap. Rising, he tipped his hat toward the rancher in mock courtesy. Think on it. The storm will pass, but my shadow will remain. With that, he left the saloon, his boots striking the floor with deliberate weight. The brides exhaled together, a sound like a release of air from a cracked barrel, and the rancher lowered himself finally into the seat across from them. His hands, rough and calloused from years of rope and reins, curled loosely on the table. He did not look at the door the stranger had walked through. His eyes stayed on the women, and though he said nothing, the steadiness in his gaze was its own kind of promise. That night, the storm broke over Dry Creek. Rain lashed the roofs, and the sky tore open with lightning. The stranger took a room at the boarding house, his carpetbag never leaving his side. The bride stayed under the watch of the preacher's wife, who insisted they not be left alone until matters were clearer. The rancher returned to his land, though more than once he looked back toward the lights of town. A silent struggle etched into the lines of his face. By morning, the town was alive with talk. At the blacksmith's forge, sparks flew as men argued whether the stranger was truly backed by law or just a trickster chasing coin. At the general store, women whispered behind shelves of flour sacks, debating whether the brides were a blessing or a curse. The preacher prayed longer still, as though hoping the words might stretch into an answer. Meanwhile, the brides themselves walked the street for the first time since their arrival. They moved carefully, their steps practiced, skirts brushing as one. Children followed at a distance, half curious, half frightened, their mothers shooing them back. Some folks nodded politely, while others looked away. Yet the brides held their heads high, every step a quiet defiance. At the edge of town, the rancher waited with his horse tied near the hitching post. He tipped his hat as they approached. "You ready?" he asked softly. The women exchanged another silent glance before nodding. Together they mounted the wagon he had brought, their joined form making the climb awkward but determined. The rancher guided the reins, and the three of them rode out toward his land, leaving behind a wake of whispers that only grew louder once they were gone. Back at the ranch, the house stood firm between the rocky hills, smoke curling from its chimney. The smaller cabin he had built for a bride sat waiting, its porch swept clean, the rocking chair steady in the morning sun. The bride stepped down and studied it, their eyes softening at the sight of a place made ready for them. For the first time since their arrival, they smiled, but peace did not linger. Across the hills, a rider was spotted, one of the ranch hands, panting hard as he pulled up. He leaned forward in his saddle, face pale. "Saw the stranger, boss." He was asking questions about your cattle, your landlines, your water rights, writing it all down in some little book. The rancher's jaw clenched. He glanced toward the brides, who stood close together, their hands clasped in quiet worry. "He's not here just for you," the rancher muttered. "He's after more than that." The brides said nothing, but the way they looked at each other carried a fear deeper than words. For they had not only brought themselves west, they had brought the eyes of men who saw them as more than women. To some, they were a curiosity, to others, a claim. And now, perhaps, a key to something larger than the town of Dry Creek could yet see. That night, the rancher sat by the fire with the brides near, the crackle of the wood filling the silence between them. He knew the stranger was not finished. He knew the town's curiosity would only grow sharper, cutting deeper until it turned into division. And he knew that whatever choice lay ahead would not be his alone. Outside, the prairie stretched dark and endless, the storm clouds drifting away but leaving the land heavy with the smell of rain. Somewhere in the distance, another rider passed unseen. And in the flicker of firelight, the three of them sat together, bound not by law nor paper, but by the weight of what tomorrow would bring. The conflict had only begun, and though the storm had passed, the air still carried the taste of thunder. The days that followed pressed down heavy on Dry Creek, like storm clouds that refused to break. The stranger stayed in town, never straying far from his carpetbag, his polished boots tapping along the boardwalk as though each step reminded the townsfolk of his presence. He visited the saloon often, ordered little, but sat for hours watching, listening, writing notes in his small book. Some whispered he was a man of the law, Others swore he was worse, someone who lived by twisting laws until they broke to his favor. No matter what he was, his shadow stretched farther with every day he remained. Out at the ranch, life tried to settle into a rhythm, though nothing about it was ordinary. The brides woke with the sun, their joined steps carrying them across the porch where the prairie opened wide. They helped with simple chores, feeding chickens, sweeping the cabin, cooking meals. Their laughter, quiet but warm, sometimes carried across the yard, and the ranch hands caught themselves stopping just to listen. Yet behind every smile lingered a weight. They knew eyes followed them, whispers grew louder in town, and the man with the black coat was not finished. The rancher kept himself busy with cattle and fences, though his mind was never far from the trouble brewing. He had lived most of his life with silence as his closest companion, and now his days were full of voices that steadied him, voices that stirred something he hadn't known he could feel. But at night, when the lantern burned low, he found himself staring toward the horizon, wondering when the stranger would make his move. The move came sooner than he expected. One morning, the preacher rode hard from town, his face pale as bone. He dismounted at the ranch yard, near collapsing from the rush. "He's gone to the county seat," the preacher said breathlessly. "Said he's taking his papers to the judge. Said by law the women aren't yours to keep." The rancher's fists tightened at his sides. The brides stood on the porch, listening, their hands clasped, their faces draining of color. One of them whispered, "If he wins, will we be taken back east?" Her sister leaned into her, eyes brimming, but no answer came. The preacher swallowed hard. "There's talk in town, too. Some folks think the stranger's right. Others think it's all a trick. But the law doesn't bend easy. If he gets the judge's word behind him, you may not have a choice." The rancher said nothing for a long while. He looked from the preacher to the women, then to the open land beyond his fences. Finally, his voice came low, steady as a hammer. "Against iron, then I'll fight it, whatever it takes." Word spread quickly, as it always did. By sundown, the whole town was split, some siding with the stranger, others with the rancher. The saloon turned into a battleground of words, men slamming fists on tables, women clutching shawls tighter as arguments broke out. The blacksmith claimed no law could tell a man who he could take into his home. The postmaster countered that contracts were contracts, and the law was written in ink. Not hope. The brides became the center of it all without ever asking. Children whispered about them in school. Townsfolk stared when they walked the street, and every choice they made seemed to carry double the weight. Yet through it, they stood side by side, their steps measured, their shoulders touching, facing down the whispers with quiet resolve. One evening, as the sun burned low and red over the plains, the stranger returned from his trip. His coat was dusty, but his expression carried victory. He walked straight to the saloon, set his carpetbag on the counter, and drew out fresh papers. "The judge has spoken," he announced. "The women are not bound here, not yet. Until the conditions are met, they remain under the custody of their family, and I hold that authority." The saloon erupted in noise, curses, and gasps rising together. The rancher was not there to hear it, but word traveled fast. By nightfall, a boy on horseback had carried the news to his ranch. The brides listened in silence as it was spoken aloud, their faces pale, their fingers twined together so tightly the knuckles showed white. The rancher's voice rumbled low. "He thinks paper makes him stronger than us. But he forgets where he stands. This is my land, not his." Still, he knew the fight would not stay on land alone. The stranger had the law, and law could ride faster than bullets. Tension boiled higher each day after. The town grew restless, shops buzzing with talk of sides and loyalties. Some feared the brides would bring nothing but trouble. that Dry Creek would become a battleground for forces larger than itself. Others saw them as a test of the town's soul, a chance to prove that humanity outweighed ink and contracts. The preacher prayed every night until his voice cracked, while the saloon grew thick with arguments that nearly tipped into brawls. Out on the ranch, nights grew heavier. The rancher kept watch from his porch with a rifle across his knees. Coyotes howled in the distance, but he knew the sound of something worse would come soon enough. The pounding of hooves carrying men who thought themselves backed by law. Brides sat inside, candlelight warming their joined faces, their eyes shadowed with worry. They had fled one cage only to risk being caught in another. Then came the rider. A ranch hand spotted him cresting the ridge one morning, a lone figure carrying not just a letter but a threat. He was no townsman, no neighbor. He carried himself like a man hired to settle matters without words. The rancher met him at the gate, rifle in plain sight. The man dismounted, handed over an envelope, and rode off without a word. The letter inside was from the stranger. It carried the judge's stamp, a demand that the brides be turned over within 3 days or the sheriff himself would come to enforce the order. The rancher crumpled it in his fist, fire burning in his chest. He looked to the women, who stared back with quiet terror, though neither spoke. Their silence was louder than any words. 3 days. That was the line drawn in dust. 3 days until law rode against heart, until paper struck against will. The rancher began preparing, though not just with weapons. He rode into town, speaking to those who still stood with him, urging them to stand ready. Some nodded, others hesitated, but by the time he left, a handful of men had promised their support. The stranger, too, gathered allies. He moved with the confidence of a man who believed the law shielded him, his papers flashing like a badge. He whispered to shopkeepers, to merchants, to the sheriff himself, weaving his net tighter. Every word he spoke made the town's divide deeper, and by the second night, folks avoided each other's eyes for fear of choosing sides too soon. On the eve of the third day, Dry Creek lay thick with unease. Lamps burned late in windows, shadows moved restless along the boardwalk, and the church bell rang once though no service was called. Out at the ranch, the bride stood on the porch with the rancher, staring across the dark plains. The air was heavy, too still, as if the land itself held its breath. The rancher's voice broke the silence at last. "They'll come tomorrow." The brides turned to him, their faces half lit by the lantern glow. One of them whispered, "And what if they take us?" Her sister squeezed her hand tight, but neither looked away. The rancher's gaze was steady, fierce as the storm clouds that once rolled across the plains. "Then they'll have to take more than that. They'll have to take all I've built, all I am. And I don't reckon I'll let that happen easy." The wind stirred, carrying with it the distant sound of riders, faint but growing. Not tomorrow. Tonight. The stranger wasn't waiting for dawn. The rancher reached for his rifle, his jaw set. The brides stepped closer together, eyes wide, hearts pounding. The night held its breath as hooves drummed nearer, the sound rising like thunder, rolling straight toward the heart of Dry Creek. The moment had come, and there was no turning back. The climax waited in the dark, its shadow stretched across the plains, promising that when the sun rose, nothing in Dry Creek would ever be the same again. The sound of hooves beat harder against the earth until it seemed the whole prairie shook with it. The brides stood pressed together on the porch, their hands clutched as if holding one another could keep the night from swallowing them. The rancher stepped forward, rifle steady, his boots planted in the dirt like roots too deep to rip free. Lantern light flickered against his face, carving shadows across his jaw, while the wide dark plains rolled on forever behind him. The riders came fast, their shapes cutting through the dust, and before long the stranger's black coat caught the lantern glow. He led them like a general, calm and certain, with the sheriff riding reluctantly at his side. Behind them trailed men from town, some faces hardened with loyalty to the stranger's papers, others just caught up in the pull of law. The riders pulled up at the gate, the horses restless under the strain. The sheriff raised a hand, his face worn, his voice low. "You've got to hand them over, or there'll be trouble." The rancher's reply was quiet but unshakable. "They came here by choice. They stay here by choice." Trouble came the moment he brought his papers to town. The stranger lifted his carpetbag with a smile, opening it once more to reveal the folded contract stamped with the judge's seal. Choice means little when the law speaks. 3 days are up. By order of the county, they return east. The brides looked at each other, their eyes searching. Then, together, they stepped forward off the porch, moving with the grace of two bound souls who had long since learned to walk as one. They stopped at the rancher's side, their voices steady, carrying across the tense night. "We are not leaving. Not with you. Not with anyone but him." The words carried more weight than any paper. A silence followed, broken only by the horses shifting uneasily. The sheriff's eyes flickered between the stranger and the rancher, torn. He was a man bound by duty, but he was also a man of the plains, and he knew well enough that law drawn up in faraway rooms often cracked when it met the hard ground of the frontier. The stranger's smile slipped. He turned to the sheriff. "Do your duty." But the sheriff did not move. His hand tightened on the reins, his jaw hardening. "Finally," he said, "duty's more than ink. These women have spoken their choice, and I won't be part of tearing them from it." A murmur rose among the riders. Some nodded, others shifted uncomfortably, but not one drew a weapon. The stranger's face twisted with frustration. "You'd defy a judge's order?" The sheriff met his glare. "Out here, a man's word and a woman's will carry more weight than stamps and seals. That's how it's always been. And that's how it'll stay." The stranger's hand hovered near his coat pocket as if to reach for something hidden, but the rancher's rifle lifted higher, the barrel steady. "Don't," the rancher said, his voice cutting sharp through the night air. The moment stretched taut, a single thread that could snap with one wrong move. But the stranger, seeing the faces around him, hardened, realizing the town would not back him, finally dropped his hand. His smile returned, though thin and cold. "You'll regret this," he said softly. "The world may forget Dry Creek, but it won't forget me." He closed his bag with a snap, turned his horse, and rode off into the night, his men scattering like dust behind him. The sheriff lingered a moment longer, tipping his hat low. "You've got friends in this town," he said quietly to the rancher. "Don't forget that. Folks will talk, sure, but most will stand where their hearts tell them." With that, he too turned back toward town, the rest of the riders trailing behind. Silence settled over the ranch. The brides let out a long, trembling breath, their hands still clasped tight. The rancher lowered his rifle, leaning it against the porch post, and for the first time in many nights, his shoulders eased. He looked at the women beside him, there, faces lit faintly by lantern glow, and though he did not speak, the warmth in his eyes said all he needed to. The days after brought a new kind of quiet to Dry Creek. The stranger did not return. Some said he had ridden east to find another judge. Others swore he had vanished into the wide plains. Whatever the truth, his shadow no longer fell across the town. The sheriff, though cautious, never received another order, and life began to slip back into its slow rhythm. Yet it was not the same as before. The story of the brides and the rancher had carved itself deep into the bones of the town. At the blacksmith shop, men worked with heavier blows, speaking of how the rancher had stood his ground. At the general store, women whispered about The courage of the brides, their resolve stronger than any law. Even the preacher's prayers grew shorter, as though the answer he had long sought had come not from heaven, but from the choice made under lantern light. For the brides, life at the ranch became steady. They found comfort in the little cabin built for them, its porch their own space to watch the prairie stretch out. They stitched new quilts, tended chickens, and planted herbs by the window. Their laughter began to return, soft at first, then freer, filling the house with a warmth it had never known. The rancher, too, changed. He still spoke little, but his silence no longer carried loneliness. He found himself listening, watching, sharing his land and his life with others who had chosen him as much as he had chosen them. The wide plains no longer seemed as empty, the nights no longer as long. Where once he had waited for letters, he now found everything he needed just beyond his porch. In town, some still whispered. Some still stared. But as the months passed, the shock dulled into something else, acceptance, perhaps even pride. Dry Creek was a small place, but its story had become larger than itself. People passing through heard it told in hushed voices. At the saloon, the tale of the loner rancher and the conjoined brides who defied law with nothing but choice and courage. Seasons turned. The cottonwoods budded green, the creek swelled with spring rains, and the ranch thrived. The stranger never returned, and his name faded into little more than a memory carried on the wind. What remained was the family that had formed in his absence, bound not by contracts but by something stronger. Something that no paper could undo. Years later, when travelers rode through Dry Creek, they would hear the same story. They would see the ranch standing firm between its hills, the rocking chair still swaying on the porch, and perhaps catch the sound of laughter drifting over the plains. And those who listened closely would hear the truth in it, that in a land where storms and shadows often ruled, it was choice, loyalty, and love that endured. The rancher never again called himself alone. The brides never again feared being taken. And the town, though small and weathered, carried their story as a reminder. That law may write the rules, but the heart writes what lasts.